it's that same psychology of cultivating the shadow side of the followers, the persecution complex that people have. That's what happens in these groups. The negative personality traits of the leader are projected onto especially the top lieutenants. And you see that with Trump, this only I can save you or save America from blank.
A critical component to mind control.
Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid.
Interested in the subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cults, Culture, and Coercion. And I am excited to reconnect with a journalist that I've known for decades. Don Lattin recently started a Substack, and I saw him posting, and we reconnected, and I said, "You've written so many amazing books and know about cults for so long. Let's do the pod." And so I'm just going to read your bio, Don, before we get going. You're an award-winning journalist, author of 7 books. Your work has appeared in dozens of U.S. magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, San Francisco Chronicle, where you worked as a staff religion writer for more than 2 decades. And earlier this year, you started a weekly series on Substack titled, funnily, Messiahs I Have Known, about his misadventures, covering cults on the religion beat. Those stories have investigated such cult leaders as Guru Dafrijan, known as Franklin Jones, and his crazy wisdom, the Nicole Dedone, the now imprisoned founder of the OneTaste orgasmic meditation movement. You did a series of posts on that. It also includes posts comparing the messianic tactics of Donald J. Trump to those of people like Jim Jones and Sun Myung Moon. And of course, Jim Jones was from San Francisco, and the whole horror of Jonestown, November 18th. We're actually doing a Cult Awareness Day. We tried to pass a bill to memorialize it. You know, Congressman Leo Ryan was killed, and his aide, Jackie Spears, went on to become a congresswoman. But I was rereading, Don, the congressional report on Jonestown. They have a whole section on the brainwashing tactics of Jim Jones, all the things that, you know, I've been talking about for 5 decades. Right. Anyway, I also want to talk about a really important book you did, the Harvard Psychedelic Club, which was about Tim Leary, Andrew Wild, Ram Dass, and Houston Smith. And how they killed the 50s and ushered in the new age for America. That won a national book bestseller and won a California Book Award, silver medal for nonfiction. Recent books, God on Psychedelics, Tripping Across the Rubble of Old-Time Religion, Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments in the New Psychotherapy. You did a book in 2003. I'm almost finished, people. But Don has a very distinguished, you know, career.
With long titles.
With long titles, but, you know, it's search engine optimization, right? Your 2003 book on the Children of God, known as The Family International, was titled Jesus Freaks, A True Story of Murder and Madness on the Evangelical Edge. And, you know, I just have a tremendous amount of respect for you, Don, so welcome to my podcast.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, so as we're recording this on November 11th, Donald Trump is systematically being the malignant narcissist. That's the stereotypical profile of cult leaders. And I compared him in chapter 3 of my book with Jim Jones and Moon and Hubbard of Scientology. But let's dive into your career. So you most recently were posting about the orgasm lady who was sent to jail, Dedone. But why don't we start there about your recent Substack articles, which are interesting for sure.
Right. Yeah, well, I'd written about Morehouse, which was a cult, a group that was that Dion and her group sort of came out of way back in the 70s. Before I was really covering religion, I was a general assignment reporter in the East Bay, east of San Francisco, and I was covering Contra Costa County and the Morehouse people. They had a big house out in Contra Costa County. So I was familiar with kind of the deep background of the whole OneTaste movement. And I also had some, they started in San Francisco, and I had some friends who were into it. So I knew quite a bit about it. And the recent Substack posts are actually something I really wrote a few years ago for a book project that, for various reasons, never saw the light of day. But so I had some of that material. So I did a 4-part series on Daniel after she was, convicted of federal charges of, I think it was forced coercion, basically kind of labor violations, really is what they got her on. And that kind of surprised me because, I had earlier, I started writing about cults, sects, new religious movements, whatever name you want to use for them, back in the 70s. And, frankly, I've seen a lot worse cases of forced coercion. And so it was interesting that the feds actually went after her. And so that kind of got my attention. And I had done an interview with her previously, which I hadn't used. So I had a lot of material on that group. And one of the things that struck me about it is, I think a lot of people, I actually think that people join new religious movements, call them cults if you want.
Yeah, I don't
Some
like
people think that's
new
a derogatory word that you shouldn't use. I refuse to give up on that word.
Yeah, me too. And that was the cult propagandist thing of call them new religious movements. But anyway, go on.
Yeah,
please.
I mean, it obviously does have a slightly derogatory tone. And I would I wouldn't use it for every group. I made my own judgment call sort of on it. Most of the people who join these groups, I think, join for many of the same reasons people join mainstream religious groups. Sure. They're in a difficult transition in their life. They're looking for meaning. Right. They're looking for connection and community. A lot of the same motivations for converting to anything, whether it's Catholicism or the OneTaste orgasmic cult. But I think what happens is a certain number of people gravitate towards the top, and it's always the inner circle I've found it's always the inner circle, the top lieutenants around the cult leader, which kind of are the most dangerous characters. Because the cult leader, almost by definition, has something going for him or her, right? They must have some message that's resonating with people. They must be speaking some kind of truth to people. And maybe we have a slightly different view of this, Steve, but it's that inner circle that kind of feeds on and mirrors the narcissism and the shadow side of the leader, and those negative aspects of the personality sort of take over the leadership. So most people who join these groups, I've found, they leave on their own. I mean, they see what's going on. And they leave on their own. They see the abuse, they see the hypocrisy. But a certain number of people, as you know, stay and become the real true believers, and that's where it can get dangerous.
Yeah, and I would just. So
with
I'm sorry, I was just going to add
OneTaste.
It's the lieutenants that run the group typically.
Right.
And if you're a lieutenant and you criticize the leader, then you're kicked out, and it becomes very clear quickly. So it becomes a reinforcing feedback loop that keeps doing narcissistic supply to the cult leader. But it is a fascinating dynamic. But for me, the critical ingredient is deceptive recruitment and mind control techniques. But please continue.
Right. No, I just say that because, I think what happens is, like, I know people who went to a OneTaste workshop, either a single person or a couple, maybe they got some good advice that helped them in their relationship, with dealing with their sexuality, and then they left. So those people, wouldn't look at this like a cult. So they read later that the woman who started this is in jail, and they're kind of puzzled because they haven't seen the inner circle, the inner dynamic.
So the pyramid is one thing, and then there are fringe. I call fringe members. But disclosure, I've had more than a few clients who are victims of Dayton. And in fact, Dayton's lawyers subpoenaed me to give my client records over to them, which I refused. But that took me out of ever commenting during the trial or even after the trial because of this subpoena for my client records. But please continue.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, if people really want an in-depth look at this group, there's a new book that's just come out I think her name is Ellen Hewitt, Huet, who was the Bloomberg business reporter who really did the first big expose of what was really going on in OneTaste. And she has a new, I think the title is, I'm doing this by memory, which is always dangerous at my age, but I think the title is Empire of Orgasm, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's just out this month.
We're going to interview her too. I was interviewed for her book. But
so she's the real expert on OneTaste. She's really done the most reporting, I think.
Well, let's move on to some of the other cults that you've covered, and I'm particularly interested in educating my audience with your decades and decades of experience covering this on your opinions about what we're seeing now in the United States of America.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Steve. I actually I wound up becoming the religion reporter for the San Francisco Examiner and then the Chronicle, because it's not the only reason, but partly because of Jonestown.
Mm-hmm.
What people forget that Jim Jones, for much of his career, was in Northern California, was not considered some crazy cult leader by most people. Right. He was seen as a politically progressive disciples of Christ, Christian denomination minister, who had an integrated church, and many churches are highly segregated, was relatively open to gays and lesbians. And he was named chairman of the Housing Authority in San Francisco by Mayor George Moscone. He was pals with people like Willie Brown, who went on to become the Speaker of the State Assembly in California. He was in the White House, hanging out with Rosalind Carter.
Connected.
So he was not. And although the warning signs of that were always there, and the first reporter, at least in California, to really get the goods on the dark side of Jim Jones was my immediate predecessor at both newspapers, a guy named the Reverend Lester Consolving, who was a funny guy. He was a right-wing Episcopal priest who actually wore his collar into the newsroom. And he was a real crusader against heresy and hedonism, not the way most of us looked at religion reporting as a secular journalist. And his claim to fame was he was the first one to start writing a series of articles on Jones. Right as Jones was coming into San Francisco, he started out in Indiana, and then he came out to Ukiah, north of San Francisco, and so Consolving went to the church up in Ukiah as he was coming down to San Francisco, and investigated the group and wrote a series of articles. It was supposed to be a 7-part series on this, what was really going on inside People's Temple, and he got there for the first time he went there, he saw armed guards, which is not typical for a Sunday, Right. so he knew something was up right away, Anyway, he wrote this series. They called Jones the Prophet. He claimed to have raised 40 people from the dead.
He did fake faith healings for sure.
Yeah, fake faith healings. So Reverend Consolving saw a heretic, and a dangerous man, and his followers would compare him to God or Jesus Christ, that he saw that. So he wrote the first part of this 7-part series. It was published in the Examiner in 1972. Mm-hmm. And then Jones responded by picketing the newspaper office, threatening lawsuits, calling Examiner editors at home, phone calls that were so intimidating that one of the editors moved his family into a motel, and in various ways, and also bribery, sweet talking, convinced the paper to stop the series in midstream.
This is the tactic
And-
Scientology does,
Right,
Synanon does, the
right,
Moonies
right. And
do.
actually, the same thing happened like 5-6 years later before Jonestown. There was another reporter at the Chronicle named Marshall Kilduff who was doing an expose,
Mhm.
and the paper wouldn't run it. And it turned out that the city editor of the newspaper was if not a member, a supporter of People's Temple. So anyway, so when the Examiner and the Chronicle look back on this after Jonestown, after the horror of Jonestown with 900 people dying in the South American jungle, they said, how did we miss this? And they saw that their previous religion writer at both newspapers, he'd worked at both papers too. And that's when they started thinking, maybe we should have a religion reporter and we would know more about what's going on in these churches, and then we would see the warning signs. So it was actually Jonestown that convinced them to revive this moribund religion beat that they'd had. And I volunteered for it because I had already written some stories about the Unification Church, probably when you were still in it. This would have been 7. Yeah. When did you leave?
I was deprogrammed in 76. So I was 74 to 76.
Okay, that's about the time. I think 77 maybe was the first stories I did for the Examiner when I was the Berkeley correspondent. And they had a big operation in Berkeley.
They had a big recruiting arm out near you, the Creative Community Project, and in Boonville.
Right.
And
Boonville,
they would, meet people at bus stations and train stations and airports and love bomb them, invite them for free dinners and ship them up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was a student at Berkeley from 72 to 76, and I was approached by people I later realized were Moonies, also Scientology. I was actually going through kind of a tough period in my life, and I actually went to a sort of an introductory kind of Scientology Dianetics thing, not knowing that's what it was. It was the classic case of an attractive woman kind of approaching
what got me,
and,
buddy. 19 years old, and 3 women, flirting and love bombing.
I was the same. I was the same age. I was 19. Yeah.
It's a very vulnerable moment. You're figuring out, who am I? You're not quite an adult. You're your last teenage year, so to speak, and you're open to learning, and you don't understand. People can look you right in the eye and lie, and be very convincing.
Yeah. And like I say, my experience is people who join these groups, they're not stupid. They're intelligent. They're often very idealistic. And sometimes they especially the People's Temple. I mean, they were crusaders for social justice. Supposedly, Jones, like a lot of these guys, he's preaching freedom, but enslaving his followers at the same time.
It is that appeal to the higher thing that you think you're going to be improving yourself and contributing to humanity, and you wind up getting coerced into donating money and your time and cutting off from friends, family, anyone who says, "Hey, what are you doing? You're in college. You have another year to graduate, Steve." And I'm like, "Yes, but the world needs, God." And it's like, "But Steve, you weren't into God, a few months ago. What happened to you?"
Right.
Come to a workshop and check it out,
Yeah. That's
so talk to you've written on the psychedelics, and this is another area that's incredibly popular. There's a lot of people experimenting. I've done a couple of talks at Harvard and other clinicians' conferences on psychedelic assisted therapy. But there's a lot of abuse that's happening. Shamans, self-proclaimed guru shamans.
There are a lot of charlatans.
So talk to us about some of your other work.
Yeah. I mean, most of my books about psychedelics have been, you'd call them relatively positive, because I think there's actually a lot of potential in the therapeutic use of psychedelics. But it really started with me in terms of writing about psychedelics with a book, The Harvard Psychedelic
Tim
Club,
Leary,
which is really which is Timothy Leary. It's a group biography of Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who were Harvard professors. Alpert went on to become Ram Dass, a very popular
Be
spiritual
Here
teacher.
Now was his famous book.
Be Here Now was his book, right. And also Houston Smith, who was a scholar of the world's religions. He was actually teaching at nearby MIT, and he hooked up with Leary in 1960. And then the fourth character is Andrew Weil, who's now known as kind of the integral medicine, holistic health guru, the guy with the big white Santa Claus beard. So it's a story of it's a story of how the psychedelic 60s was born through the story of these four guys' lives. So that's how I started kind of writing about psychedelics, or the history of this really interesting time. Kennedy had just been elected. There was a lot of hope and idealism, in the air, and Leary, Timothy Leary, who I think people obviously from our generation remember, maybe some younger people don't.
Yeah, I remember him. I met him, but we have to say it was MK Ultra and experiments with LSD that was a major contributor to this whole thing at Harvard.
Yeah, the CIA was before Leary, actually. I mean, in the 50s, the CIA was doing a lot of because there were reports that Russia was using psychedelics and testing it as like a truth serum or all kinds of crazy stuff, like spraying it on enemy troops as like a weapon of mass distraction.
There was a war for who could develop mind
it was part
control.
of the Cold War. It was part of mind control, the whole thing with the North Koreans, all that. Leary wasn't actually, I don't think Leary himself actually came out of that, but a lot of the research, not Leary's, but a lot of the other research that was being done at that time was funded by the CIA, but the researchers often didn't know that.
Exactly.
Because the CIA would set up these front groups to support it. So I don't think the CIA was. I mean, they went after Leary. The FBI and the CIA went after Leary, but I don't think they were really behind him or Ram Dass. But they were behind some of the other research. That's true.
Right. But just to state the obvious, relative to me, this Cold War thing about figuring out what are the Russians up to with mind control and brainwashing, etc. I did two chapters in a clinical hypnosis textbook on the dark side of hypnosis. Alan Shefflin, who you may know because he was a professor of law at Santa Clara University out your way, wrote a chapter on the MK Ultra thing. And in particular, Alan Dulles said hypnosis was the one thing that really was the superpower on how to influence people.
Yeah. No, people are very suggestible on psychedelics, and it's one of the problems with the research. I mean, I think there is some potential, say, for people with PTSD to use maybe MDMA, which is known as ecstasy, in a controlled, cautious, careful way with a therapist to deal with the trauma of their PTSD and to relive that in a way that's vivid, but with someone who can help you get through it if it's a bad trip. So, I'm talking like 1 or 2 sessions with a trained therapist. I think there is potential. So I'm not saying these are necessarily always dangerous drugs. Nor
am I.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, you are so hyper suggestible state that it is easy to plant ideas in people's mind. And that's part of the problem with the research, because it's like people come into this with an expectation, also what your expectations are.
Right.
But, even if you have that, if it helps you with your PTSD or your depression or your substance abuse, whatever you're if it works,
but
it works.
It's not the first thing you should do. If you have issues, you should be evaluated. And you correctly said it should be with therapists who are trained on how to use it in an ethical way. And part of the ideology that I'm critical of is this notion that you have a divine wisdom that knows the truth, and it really can set people up for being given very dangerous ideas and suggestions and such.
It can be,
Yeah.
and Leary and Alpert, once they were kicked out of Harvard for some abuses in the sexual abuse and other things. I mean, their research at Harvard was not like the research today. I mean, it was more like a party
Right.
than a research project.
Well, it was the Milgram and the Zimbardo prison study that formed, the IRB, the Internal Review Boards on human experiments, where you had to get permission before you did anything with humans.
Yeah, and it was sort of before that. It was before. Yeah, there weren't the same safeguards against using human subjects as there are now.
Exactly.
And people didn't know what psychedelics were. They were new. They were still legal, for one thing. LSD wasn't made illegal till 66, 67, depending on where you were. So anyway, that was the first book I wrote with Harvard Psychedelic Club about those four characters. And then I did a book called Changing Our Minds, which was about these clinical trials, and also about so-called psychedelic churches. Some of which are obvious front groups to basically get around the law. There's a church in the Bay Area called Zydor, which is very popular, which is basically a mushroom distributor posing as a church. But there are some other groups that I think are in their own way sincerely exploring this territory. There are some ayahuasca, which is another psychedelic from two plants that are native to South America. There are, established religious denominations in Brazil, syncretic movements in Brazil that use psychedelics, since they've established congregations up here. And I think some of these people are, sincerely exploring this territory. But you're right; there are also all kinds of charlatans out there. These churches that are part of a denominational structure, they're a little safer because they do have some oversight, right?
Yeah, agreed.
It's the freelance prophets, whether they're in the evangelical world or whatever, that are the more dangerous ones. Ones that have some kind of a structure, like accountability structure, are safer in my view. Right?
Yeah, no, I'm totally in agreement with you. Yeah. So. Tell us about Friedjan. I know and work with some former victims of him.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Friedjan, whose given name was Franklin Jones. He's gone through several names. Now he's known posthumously as Adi Da. It's interesting. You can tell how dangerous a guru is by how many times he changes his name. I mean, I found,
good point.
And it's usually in response to negative media attention.
Yeah, like Rajneesh became Osho.
Becomes Osho, right, right. That's a good example of that. So, Da Friedjan was one of these guys who, came out in the 70s, sort of the cult wars of the 70s and all of that. He was born Franklin Jones. He borrowed, like a lot of these guys borrowed from various things. He borrowed from kind of Vedanta, this non-dual mysticism of the Vedanta, the Indian philosophical system. He was in Scientology for a while, borrowed from that, a little bit of Taoism, a little bit of Zen, a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism. And he was a charismatic character. He was, in some people's minds, his books were kind of insightful about the mystical core that kind of unites the world's religions. You can go like that, but that's why people were attracted to him, because he did have some interesting ideas.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah, and Rajneesh was very bright.
Rajneesh was
a
too.
whole bunch
of
books too.
Yeah.
But he was also just a horrible pervert and just abused people. He had an island, I think one of his followers donated to Adi Da.
Well, that's the story that so in my Substack series, Messiahs I Have Known, I write it actually started out with like a 7-part series on Da Friedjan, because what happened in that case, there was a lawsuit that was filed by some defectors, some high-level defectors.
Mm-hmm.
This is how these groups often sort of fall apart, is there's a split at the top, often over money and power. Or, in Da Friedjohn's case, he had this interesting habit of seducing the wives and girlfriends of his followers. And that kind of caught up with him eventually.
Yeah, it was a sex
it's amazing
pervert.
how people will go along with that, how men will go along with that. But in this case, there was a woman who happened to be a former Playboy Playmate of the Month,
Right.
September 1976, who was one of Da Friedjohn's 9 wives who were living on this island, which a follower of his bought for him in Fiji, a freehold island where they could do whatever they wanted. It was almost like their own country.
Yep.
And there was a lawsuit by some top-level people claiming that all kinds of abuse was going on at the island and that people were being kept there against their will, perhaps including this former Playboy Playmate. So, of course, this had all the elements of a very sensational tabloid newspaper story. Sex-crazed guru on his own island with 9 wives, one of whom is a Playboy Playmate. So the Examiner dispatched me and a photographer all the way to Fiji to investigate this. And it's a long story, but we wound up, first they wouldn't let us on the island. We went to the nearby island. And we were starting to figure out what was going on because there were people at the nearby island knew what was going on the cult's island. So they eventually let us on and let us interview the Playmate, who of course claimed that she's there. She was not, no, I'm not brainwashed. I'm here. It's all wonderful,
Right.
And so it was quite an adventure, just that whole story of chasing this guy all the way to this island in Fiji. That woman, by the way, the Playmate, is still a devotee. She's still around.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, she is. And although there's actually been a split in the cult, which, as you know, often happens when the leader dies. There's a power struggle. And so she's against the current leadership, but she's still, very positive about her experiences with Da Friedjon.
Yeah, people can walk physically out of a cult or be kicked out of the cult, but the cult doesn't leave their brain. And for me, having been a survivor who became a mental health professional and has been working for decades, I really think people should clean up their past and understand what happened to them and not just idealize and rationalize. And also, many times they disconnect from family and friends who really were traumatized and still love the person and wish they were in their lives.
Yeah.
It's really sad.
Actually, to sort of tie in with the psychedelic thing, there was a lot of psychedelic use in both OneTaste in the early movement when they were living communally and establishing, Nicole De Dion was establishing the people who would be the leaders. There was a lot of psychedelic use. And also with Da Friedjon, they went through a period where, I think in that case, I think psychedelics maybe were a tactic that some of the leaders did use.
For sure.
Both to give people these powerful experiences, which can seem like true revelatory mystical experiences. And also, because like I said, people are susceptible to suggestions, coercion under these drugs.
Yeah.
The other thing about psychedelics is that's often said, it's ego dissolution. You have a mystical experience because you and that can happen, which can be kind of a revelatory. I've experienced it myself. It can be a revelatory experience, but also they can fuel grandiosity. Yeah. Especially in the leaders.
Yeah.
And these are people who already have a messianic kind of character, or maybe they already have narcissistic tendencies, to say the least.
Yeah, the grandiosity, the certainty, the need for praise and admiration, etc.
Yeah. Timothy Leary is a good example. He definitely had a messianic kind of mindset. He was going to first revolutionize psychology, and then he was going to save the world. With psychedelics. That didn't quite turn out that way.
Yeah, I remember. I actually remember that. So we've covered a lot of historical cults and some more recent ones, but I really am curious what you think of what's happening in the United States right now as a citizen, but also as someone who is a professional journalist. What do you think? What's happening?
I just wrote a piece that I think is going to be published for the anniversary of Jonestown in the Chronicle, an op-ed piece where I do talk about that. And when Trump first came on the scene, when he ran the first time,
2015, when he said he wanted a total Muslim ban.
Yeah, and just looking at him, I did have these kind of strange echoes or flashbacks, speaking of psychedelics, flashbacks, to my years of covering some of these cult leaders, especially Jim Jones. You've written about how he reminded you of Moon because you were involved with Moon.
I grew up 1 mile from him, buddy. I grew up in New York. I knew Donald Trump was cheating people and philandering on women my whole life. So when I was asked by my book agent to write The Cult of Trump, I knew he had a cult of personality. I knew he had a malignant narcissistry. But I didn't know there were actual cults in the cult of Trump. And cults that were manipulating him.
But Jones, and then so we saw that, of course, during the first Trump era. That's the cabinet meetings, with the slavish devotion. It's you've written about this in your book, about how it reminded you of what meetings with Moon. It was shocking when we first saw this. We kind of almost gotten used to it, which is a little troubling.
It's malignant normalization is the technical term.
But so that whole thing, and when he ran the second campaign, he came off much more as like an angry prophet. Like, I am your retribution. I think that was his, and I talked to people, and it reminded me of Jones. And then I actually called people, who were members of People's Temple, and they said, a lot of people had flashbacks to Jones when they saw things like that, or when Trump would say, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and wouldn't lose a single follower. People who survived Jim Jones thought, I just heard the voice of Jim Jones. And then you look at the whole dynamic of with his hardcore base. I'm not talking about everyone who voted for Trump. Everyone who voted for Trump is not a member of this cult, if you want to call it a cult. But the real hardcore base of around Trump, and it's similar to Jones in that there's this persecution complex, and there's this deep distrust of the so-called deep state. Now, in Jones's case, Jim Jones, that was the CIA, and he was a left-wing. It was a left-wing persecution complex that the capitalists are out to get us, right? And the CIA, and he called himself an apostolic socialist. That's what Jones said he was, right? So, but it's the same thing with Trump. It's just the politics have flipped. So now it's the right. Now it's the right wing against the deep state. And it's not apostolic socialism; it's white nationalism. That is the ideological core behind it. So, but it's the same, as Steve, more than anyone. It's that same psychology, right? Of cultivating the kind of the shadow side of the followers, the persecution complex that people have through your own persecution complex. And, as that's what happens in these groups. The negative personality traits of the leader are projected onto especially the top lieutenants, as we said before. And you see that, with Trump, only I can save you or save America from blank.
Exactly.
Right? Whether it's the left or the right.
It's
the same psychology.
It's black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil. And I've been victimized, and making people swear loyalty to the lie that January 6th wasn't a violent coup attempt to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, which it is.
We saw with our own
We
eyes.
saw it with our own eyes.
With our own live on television.
Yeah, and all of these GOP people who are just like sucking it up. That's what really gets to me. Like, are they bought off? Like, how much of it is there in an information silo? How much is it, Russia influence? And it's
or just self-serving political motivation.
There's definitely that. There's the oil corporations and the countries that want to deny science and say, "Yep, we are warming the planet. Let's get rid of any regulation against, use of fossil fuels." It's the tech billionaires who don't want regulation and want their own network state that supersedes even governments. And it remains to be seen whether governments will allow billionaire trillionaires to have a supra network that controls everything. But it seems like we're going surveillance state, Don. It seems like we're going China here with Palantir and Teal. And it looks like
that stuff is very frightening. And I think since your book came out, and you warned of this early on, your Cult of Trump book. But since then, I think the two events that really helped fuel this were the assassination attempt on Trump,
which I question whether it was real.
Okay, well, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not. I don't claim to know.
I don't know. I'm told
even if it was
a while to heal if it's actually shot with a bullet, and he had the white bandage, and then 2 weeks later it was fine with not even a scar. Looked a little suspicious to me. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, could be. Whether it was or not, it matters, of course. But I mean, it fueled this idea in Trump's mind, at least, and in others, that God saved me to save America. Now, if this was all a conspiracy to do that, then they really worked. And I tend to think it probably wasn't, but it doesn't matter in the sense that this result was the same.
Right.
We have this feeling, not just among, I don't know if Trump really believes this or not. It's hard to say. I think he's deluded himself. To the point
I don't think he's sane anymore. I think he's got dementia. I think he's got all kinds of issues going on.
You had that, and then I just noticed it was like just a few weeks ago. Steve Bannon did a bunch of interviews where he's talking about Trump will serve another term. And, Bannon was using words like, he said something like, well, he's not perfect, he's not churchy, but he's an instrument of divine will. That's what Bannon said.
Bannon's been working all over the world to promote right-wing authoritarianism.
Right. And then the other assassination, the real assassination, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, really fueled this too, because now we have a martyr, and that is a very powerful tool to use.
And then I'll add this militarization thing, moving the National Guard and telling all of the military they should, the enemy within, and attacking Milley, who called Trump outright a fascist and very dangerous.
And going after the media, the enemy of the people. Right.
Suing the media, exactly. Yeah. You have to control information if you want to control minds.
Right.
And but the social media tech, billionaires are having a lot of effects. People are addicted to their cell phones and social media, and there's a lot of AI algorithms being launched on people.
Yeah. And then the other side of this, which I see as someone who covered religion for a long time, is how Trump has co-opted, much of the evangelical, not all, but much of the Christian evangelical and the charismatic Christian, the Pentecostal movement, where there's this idea, it's been there for a long time, of like spiritual warfare. fueled by
New
apocalyptic
Apostolic
prophecy.
Reformation.
New Apostolic Reformation. I wrote some articles back in the 80s about, we didn't call it that then, but there was something called the shepherding movement, which was a
Exactly.
very,
You got it.
yeah, I mean, I think I was the first reporter to really write a big expose of the shepherding movement, which was a pyramid-shaped
Exactly.
structure with 5 guys at the top, and they had they had 12 people below them. It was all like 12, 12, 12, 12. And they would go into existing churches and basically infiltrate them and get them out of whatever denomination or accountability structure
Especially
they had.
Church of Christ, the Boston Church of Christ, the international.
Yeah, a lot of
Churches
different churches, and
Yep.
and so a lot of the people who were and they eventually kind of were, some of them even admitted that they went overboard in terms of the coercion.
They're
and
still
the
at
control.
it, though.
They're still at it, yeah, and now they're part of this excuse me, new apostolic reformation, and that's very dangerous too, because you're dealing with apocalyptic prophecies and this whole idea of spiritual warfare, which doesn't necessarily mean actual violent warfare.
Oh,
but
I think it does.
There's another way people will say they look at it, but you can, that line can get blurred where you're talking about not spiritual but actual.
Yeah, well, they're quoting
and warfare.
Jethro and
Right.
actual armies. But I just
Yeah.
want to state for my listeners, to be clear, evangelical Christians believe in Jesus, and they don't believe human beings are prophets or apostles who can speak to God. These are, in my opinion, bite model of authoritarian control cults, where the leaders have everyone dependent on them because they're so afraid of demonic possession.
Right.
And it's the leaders who say, God, I prayed and God told me Trump won the 2020 election. So don't listen to the media. It's Satan. Don't listen to the 61 judges that ruled that Biden won in 2020. And these people believe because they have phobias that terrible possessions are going to happen. And a lot of these men and women, including Paula White Cain, who's in the White House, claim they can do exorcisms. And if you have doubts, it's because of a demon, not because you have a conscience and critical thinking.
Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. It's not, obviously we're not talking about all Christians or even all evangelicals.
Right.
And but then there's another group of evangelicals that maybe wouldn't fall into the category you're speaking of, but who look at Trump as, well, we know he's not a man of Christ, we look at his lifestyle.
Right.
But he can get it done. Like he can get abortion banned, which he did, right? So they look at him like in like King Cyrus, who
That's
like
what they quote.
helped the Jews come back, from Mesopotamia, from Babylon to rebuild the temple. I mean, in Israel, that's how he's such a hero. That I mean, they think that
even Netanyahu said he was a King Cyrus.
Yeah,
figure.
yeah, and of course they ignore the fact that these evangelicals also think that if you don't convert and accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you're going to go to hell.
Exactly.
But the Israelis understand that. They're using Trump politically, and the same thing here with the religious right. The more mainstream religious right, that he's co-opted them politically. Maybe not so much psychologically as at a deep level you're talking about with some people, but politically he's useful for them, and it's kind of a dangerous situation in that sense too.
Indeed. So, are you still living in the Bay Area, John?
I am. I'm in the East Bay, Alameda, an island in the San Francisco Bay. It sounds more exotic when I describe it that way.
Because Trump was going to dispatch the National Guard, and then I guess the NVIDIA and other tech people said, no, we don't need it.
Yeah, that's actually, I actually am just blocks away from there's an estuary, there's a little between the mainland of the East Bay. Alameda is like an island, and Coast Guard Island, which was where they were just going to dispatch the ICE troops. Mm-hmm. There was a big protest. So they blocked the road. And, it's said that the reason Trump pulled back is because of his tech bros, calling him up. And that's part of it. But there was also a real organized opposition that was forming, I think, that was on the minds of the tech bros.
I see.
So I don't think it was just that one thing, but it was. So they've pulled back for now, at least in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
But,
so Don, as we're wrapping up, you have any other projects other than letting people, come into your Substack? And you said you have a op-ed that will be coming out on the anniversary of the Jonestown.
I'm sort of slouching towards retirement in a way these days. I don't have another book, on the horizon. I've done 7. I am doing the Substack series because there's a lot of stories about cults that I never really was able to tell in the way I wanted to tell them. So I'm doing that with the Substack. My book, Harvard Psychedelic Club, just got optioned again for a film, and I might be working on that with the screenwriter. And
nice.
It's the 3rd time it's been optioned, so maybe the 3rd time's the charm. But it would make a great movie or a streaming series. So I'm excited about that, about trying to get that project off the ground.
Great. Well, I want to thank you. You haven't.
Thank you.
Any last words? They're yours. But go to check out Don Lattin. What do you call your Substack? Is it just your name?
Well, it's just under just Google my name, Don Lattin, Lattin, on Substack. I'm calling it Messiahs I Have Known, but it's not officially the title. It was an idea. I thought I might write a book. Some slightly amusing book. I know you don't think this is amusing at all, but there are some amusing aspects to covering cults.
I do admit it's one of my issues. I have trouble making jokes about it when people say, well, I joined this thing and I drank the Kool-Aid. I'm like, that's not funny. I know people who lost loved ones who drank the Flavor Aid and died, and that's not cool. Yeah. But people know that people can be so taken over that they give up their choice and their freedom. Yeah. And
it was Jonestown that really changed the way people look at cults, and I think you're right. A lot of them, there are very dangerous aspects to this, but on the other, I also think everything is not another Jonestown.
Right.
And that idea was, I think. So I've always tried to especially writing for a secular newspaper where I'm supposed to be objective and fair. Sure. I always try to. There are people I would call some people alarmists, some people apologists,
right?
And I kind of tried to find the middle way.
That's the journalistic standard. For me, I have an influence continuum from ethical to unethical. A lot of them are in the middle. And I actually use the cult word to describe even fandoms like Taylor Swift or baseball series Dodgers or that people are fanatical. They spend time and energy and they buy merch and they go to things, but they still have their personality and their free will. And nobody shuns them if they change their mind and don't want to follow the team anymore. And
the former Pope, the Polish Pope, Pope John Paul II, he had a very strong devotion to Mary. And some people would say he was in the cult of Mary within the Catholic Church, and they weren't being critical. It just showed it basically just he had an unusual devotion. A group of many Catholics have an unusual devotion to the Virgin Mary, and sometimes you can call that a cult. It doesn't mean it's bad, right?
And the key is informed consent. Nobody's telling you you can't, read critical points of view or talk to people who aren't of your group, which is what happened in the Moonies. We couldn't talk to ex-members. We couldn't read negative articles at all. And we were pretty much given phobias that we would be possessed by demons if we ever wanted to leave.
Exactly. And all religions start as cults or sects.
That's why
an offshoot of something. Like Christianity was an offshoot of Judaism. And then there are ones that are more like come out of seemingly out of nowhere, like the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That was the most notorious cult in this country, the history of America. And now it's a major world religion with 10 million followers. And most people wouldn't use the word cult to describe it.
I do.
But most people
have been helping
wouldn't.
a lot of people exit it because I have this scientific model looking at behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. But my hope is always not just to call names, but to shed a light and encourage reforms. If there are entities interested in reforming, please do, because I'm a human rights guy in the end, and I believe, in the I do believe in God, but not with a beard that's white floating in the clouds. Right. And I just think that love should be the main motivator, not fear or anger.
Amen. Let's end on that note.
Thank you, Don Lattin. Take care, buddy.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Steve.